Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Stout. I'm a county commissioner from El Paso, Texas. Very honored to have been asked to participate in this press conference this afternoon to talk about the announcement that the Trump administration made that they are walking back their decision to close down the border. And I'm happy to be joined this afternoon by a number of state representatives. We have Armando Martinez, Poncho Nevarez, Representative Sergio Munoz, Gina Kalani, and Carl Sherman. And from El Paso, I have to give him a shout out, one of my representatives, Art Fierro. They asked me just to come up and kind of give a perspective on the border in El Paso and what this means for our area. I think that it's probably a good thing that the president has decided that he is not going to try to close the border, but I think a lot of damage has already been done with the overtures that he has made in the past regarding this issue, and it's going to continue to damage our community. This false narrative that the Trump administration and the Republican leadership in this state as well have been disseminating is quite damaging to communities like El Paso. It's we are the largest borderplex in the Western Hemisphere. We have a great relationship with our Mexican neighbors in Ciudad Juarez. And it's very difficult for local elected officials like myself when we are reaching out and speaking with our counterparts on the Mexican side, to try to explain to them what's going on and why these types of things are happening. I think that the president probably realized that this is going to be doing much more damage to our economy here than it would to Mexico. I think that this is just part of this extended silly game that he is playing with the border. It's so easy to demonize the border. It's easy to demonize immigrants, and a lot of what's happening in El Paso is, we've heard talks about an emergency. In the Senate here the other day, we had an emergency declaration through a resolution, which I know that the Democrats fought hard to keep that from what it was, but it's just not true. Coming from El Paso, I can assure you that there really is no emergency in our border. They talk about maybe a crisis, and what's the definition of a crisis? I don't know what some of these folks are trying to define a crisis as, but if there is a crisis, it's a manufactured crisis, especially when it comes to the refugees that are coming into El Paso. I get a text message every day from Ruben Garcia, who's the leader of the Annunciation House, which is the local nonprofit that is leading the way when it comes to taking care of these folks when they are released into our community. And we get upwards of 500, 600, 700 refugees being released into our community. But the way that our community has reacted has been very positive. We are taking care of them, and we're getting them on their way to where they need to be, to their sponsors, which 99% of the time is somewhere else in the United States. And you read the headlines, you hear about the Border Patrol, quote unquote, apprehending hundreds of immigrants on the border in Antelope Wells, New Mexico, for example. The reason that is happening is because there are Customs and Border Protection agents placed at the middle of the bridges, on every bridge, at least in El Paso, in the middle of the bridge, and they are checking people's IDs. They're keeping people from setting foot on American soil, which would allow them to start the asylum process. These are folks that are seeking asylum. And it's pushing them to the outlying areas. And these folks are not running away from the authorities, they're running to them, into their arms, into their hands, and asking them for asylum. And so the only crisis I think that exists is a manufactured crisis, and we are going to continue to have to deal with this. This is becoming the new norm in El Paso and along other communities along the border. And we, the prospect of having our border closed would be so detrimental. Jobs in El Paso are dependent upon folks, Mexican shoppers coming over and spending money in our stores and spending money, buying vehicles, staying at our hotels, going to the movies and buying clothing and things like that. I think we've all seen in the media the whole deal with the avocados, and 40% of vegetables that the United States consumes comes from Mexico. There would be not just detrimental to border communities like my own, but to probably every community in the United States. And so I think that we need to continue to be vigilant. We need to continue to fight, join together like we're doing here with fellow Democrats, especially here at the state, and try to dispel that myth, dispel the negativity, dispel the false narrative that is coming out of the administration, and work with our counterparts in Congress to support them and make sure that they are successful in stopping any type of closure of the border. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Representative Mando Martinez, who's going to follow up. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and good afternoon. We're also joined by Representative Gina Hinojosa, who's just entered the room. I believe a couple of our other colleagues are out laying out bills, especially our caucus chairman, Chris Turner, who will be joining us shortly. But this self-manufactured crisis created by the president threatened our local, state, and federal economies. There should never have been a threat of a shutdown on the border. Our southern border and international ports of entry are economic drivers of our economy. They create jobs, increase revenue, and they're the gateway to the United States of America, and we are the front door to the United States. The contributions of trade along our southern border cannot be overstated. Give you a few statistics. Our southern border crosses $1.6 billion in two-way trade daily. Over 1 million people cross, and half of our imported produce comes directly from Mexico. Closing the border, which was already announced was going to happen with commercial lanes at the Bridge of the Americas in El Paso, in order to shift personnel to process migrant families, would have sent economic shockwaves throughout the country while doing little to solve the humanitarian issue. For our trade at the ports of entry, every minute of delay, and you're going to understand what we're talking about, how important it is not to shut down the border. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce International Trade Administration, a study done in 2008, for every minute of delay at the border, there's a $116 million average economic output loss. That's $116 million for every minute of delay. This is projected through costs of 54,000 jobs that are foregone, $6 billion lost in output, $3 billion in lost wages, and $1.2 billion lost in tax revenue. So we know what the shockwaves would have done if President Trump would have not stood down and removed what he was trying to do. At this time, I would also like to bring up our representative from the border, Poncho Nevares.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. This is a victory. It's a victory for sanity, and it's a victory that's led by Democrats, but I think it's a victory that speaks to people that want assurances that our country will operate in a sane and civil manner. It's a victory for stability. It's a victory against visceral talking and visceral decisions that lead us down paths that we cannot come back from. And I'm not anybody that likes to speak in hyperbole, but I will say this: if the border had been shut down the way they wanted to shut it down, it would have been devastating, absolutely devastating. And there's so many examples that we've already heard on how it would have been devastating, but there's more. And I was shocked that the president continued to push this, and I'm grateful that the men and women that have some influence in the administration, because men and women like the people behind me are vocal about it, and then get these people up in Washington to talk to these folks, we're able to get this man to stand down. And hopefully he'll get involved with another ball of yarn that he can push down the road in 6 months or a year. But we can never be, we always have to be vigilant about what the man says and what he's doing here. Markets are heaving up and down because of words that hurt. The psychosis right now that we're living and the stress that people live on the border right now because of these things is also incalculable. And for those of you who don't live on the border, you live it every day. And I haven't been there this week, but just hearing from my wife, from my in-laws, from people that do business on the border, they're stressing me out and I'm up here. And I'm sure when I get back tomorrow, I'm gonna be just as relieved but stressed out because you don't know when the other shoe's gonna drop with this man. And that's the problem that we have. But fortunately, we have a good group of leaders here in this state on the Democrat side that are pushing this narrative. We have leaders that, believe me, are not just Democrats, they're not just Republicans, they're just people that care about sanity, normalcy, and the rule of law, and especially a policy that comes from Washington that is not hurtful but helpful. And let's break this down because Commissioner David Stout said something very important here is, think about this. They're positioning BP officers, and I know this because I walk across our bridge sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, right on the edge to deny somebody the opportunity to enter the U.S. and therefore pushing them outside to create the illusion that somehow there's more traffic between the ports. So they can do what? Influence us to build a wall. That's terrible. Think about what was done in the last 2 weeks, the threat of ending aid to the 3 Mexicos, and I use that in quotations. Ending aid to do what? To push more people to come to create what? More of a chaos, more of a chaotic situation, more of a disturbance, more of a reason to do things ham-handed and half-baked. And as my mom says, basta, ya basta, it's enough. And we're just sick of it. And at some point, we're gonna have a decision that we have to make about who's gonna govern us and how. And I can tell you that those of us in the know and those of us that should be learning how this goes, we're gonna look really hard at people that back these things and look really hard at people that believe that somehow this is good government, because it's not. It is absolutely not. And so, thank you. And with that, I introduce another colleague of ours from the border who can tell you a lot about the commerce in FAR, which is one of the most important produce entry points in the U.S. He can tell you a lot more about it. Sergio Munoz.
Thank you, Representative. And I know Representative Martinez also mentioned some of the stats that we were talking about, but when you look at the FAR International Bridge, it's the 6th largest land port of entry, the 4th largest on the U.S.-Mexico border. And we talk about fresh produce and the imports, but it's the #1 importer for avocados and berries and the #2 for tomatoes. The other thing that is not mentioned is the crossings that we have, which is northbound or southbound. If you look at 2017, there was an estimated over 580,000 southbound trucks crossed, and we had about 621,000 northbound trucks that are crossing the bridge in the year. So when you look at the amount of economic activity and volume that we have and how dependent we are, not only locally, but as a state and as a nation, when it comes to international trade, it's something that we have to be very mindful of in terms of policy and moving forward. And I think the frustration that has been mentioned by many of my colleagues has always been that for us that live along the border and that are trying to look at solutions, sometimes they want to keep the people that actually live there out of those conversations. And I don't think that at the end is very helpful. Because when you live there and you grew up there and you want the best for your community, you want to be able to give your perspective and show that we can work together to make things happen for the betterment, not only for everybody who lives on the border, but for this state and for the rest of the nation. And that's something that we want to continue to do going forward. As Representative Nevares mentioned, today it is a victory knowing that it's not going to happen, but we always have to be mindful that things can change at the turn of a dime, as you all know. And the uncertainty, the fear that people live in, not only those that live in those communities, in our communities, but also the people that are involved in business, is something that is not going to be changed from one minute to the next, because everybody is looking long-term. And I know that we're looking at ways to work together to move forward, but it's something that we continue to have to do, and the only way we can do it is if we're at the table to talk about those solutions. So thank you very much for your time and for listening to us and giving us an opportunity to speak and give our perspective. And with that, I don't know if there's
Any of the other representatives?
anybody else want to say anything?
Our border colleagues should lead this effort.
Representative.
No. I defer to our border colleagues on this.
Okay, well, so then we can
I'd like to open up for questions.
open up for questions. And if anybody needs Spanish, I know, well, I don't know if Poncho he left, I know he speaks Spanish. I can do it in Spanish, you can do it in Spanish as well. So we can do breakouts in Spanish if you'd like, but if there are any questions.
A couple of questions. Obviously, the president has called this off. So one, why do you think he did that? And then two, can you speak about the threat that he may bring it back in a year if the migration surge is going to come down?
Yeah, I think
Keep in mind also that next year will be an election year.
I think the only thing that I can say from what we know is that I think one of the reasons why maybe the tone changed and the idea of shutting it down was now more of saying, well, if Mexico doesn't do certain things within the year, then this is going to happen, is because we heard a lot of business and leaders, I think, not only throughout the state but throughout the nation, that I think started to come forward and give their position as to what this would do and how detrimental it would be to our economy. And I would venture to say that that was a probably very moving factor in maybe looking at other ways to find a solution. Now, going forward, what happens within the next 6 months or the year is the uncertainty that we all talk about. And the challenge, though, is just one, trying to get people in the same room to talk about it and to maybe find common ground. And for us as a state, a lot of times we have the issues of immigration, we have other issues that are brought before us, but when people don't like the way the federal government or the law is worded or the way that it's applied, that's something that congressional action needs to take to fix it. And you know, for us in the border, a lot of times we're being blamed for somehow being responsible for the situation, which at the end, we're not responsible for that. It's because of the issues with immigration that haven't changed. People don't like the way the asylum or the refugee status is used. Well, then that's something at the federal level also needs to be addressed. And I mean, we want to continue to have a prosperous community, and we want to continue to build for the future. And the only way that we can make that happen is for people to allow us to continue to be prosperous.
As Democrats, you're gearing up for a big year in 2020, and
Yes.
you feel like the wind is at your back. Deferring this argument over immigration and shutting down the border for a year for the law, isn't that where he wants to be next year and having that conversation?
Yeah, and I think that's why Representative Arias mentioned what he said, which is, you know, it comes to a point where you see all these things happening, especially when you can see them firsthand, and it makes you wonder whether or not we even want to get it to a solution, or this is just campaign fodder to get everybody into a position for the next year, which is where you're going.
Earlier this week, the Senate passed a resolution declaring a security crisis at the border responses, and does the House have any plans to bring up any sort of legislation, I guess, contrary to that?
Not that we're not aware of any of that at this time. The House doing anything similar. I don't know if any of my colleagues here have heard anything different.
A quick follow-up question on that, maybe for Commissioner Stout, or I don't know if Representative Fierro is here, but, you know, we have correspondents down at the border, and we do see the pictures of the migrants in sort of essentially a cage.
Under the bridge, yes.
Under the bridge,
Mhm.
right? So when you talk about there not being a crisis, or there not being, because that seems like a crisis to us.
It's part of that manufactured crisis that I'm talking about. So the federal government is willing to spend, I don't know how many millions of dollars on the baby jail that we had in Tornillo, on the Tornillo port of entry last year, but they're not willing to spend money to set up humane shelters for these people to put them in while they're processing them. That, in my opinion, that's a manufactured part of that manufactured crisis that I was talking about.
And I think it is the security crisis that is the manufactured crisis, but I think there is a humanitarian crisis that we need to deal with good diplomacy that is lacking in this administration.
Right, and earlier you were asking about, you know, whether things are going to change in a year. I don't. In El Paso, we're gearing up for this to be the new normal for until the presidential elections and possibly having a new administration, because you know, the root causes are not being addressed. You know, they're actually they're doing things that are making things worse, like retiring the funding from the other 4 Mexicos, right? And so, you know, and the push and pull factors are not going to go away in a year, whether it's immigration or whether it's drugs.
But just to Representative Inos's point, I mean, what y'all are saying is that it's not that there isn't a crisis, but there's a humanitarian crisis that's not being addressed.
That's
And
right.
that's what we need to focus on.
That's
as
right.
a-
That's right.
When it comes to security, El Paso is the safest city with a population of 500,000 or more over the last 10 years, and nothing has changed since, you know, the beginning of this latest influx of refugees.
What are these points of entries under the bridge, like you were just mentioning? What did these areas in El Paso look like 3 years ago?
The ports of entry are bridges that cars and people go across every day. Commerce and people walk, people drive. There are trucks on a number of the ports of entry. We've never seen, you know, people corralled in a cage under one of our ports of entry before in El Paso. I'm glad that they've gotten rid of that. It was one of the ugliest things I've ever seen.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you all.
Can we get some in Spanish?
Sí.